I was just turning 11 when Ang Lee's Hulk came out in 2003. In fact, it was released the day before my 11th birthday here in the UK. 11 is a pretty transformative age. Your body is being bombarded with an explosion of gamma rays, by which I mean hormones. To add to this, I was feeling especially nervous that summer about starting high school in a new area where I wouldn't know many people. In hindsight, I think this is the moment when I became a kind of anxious and introverted kid. The Hulk had always been one of my favourite Marvel characters from as early as I can remember. I watched the 90s cartoon on Saturday mornings, and I liked how his action figures could always withstand more abuse than your average Spider-Man or Luke Skywalker. Hulk was the ultimate power fantasy for any noodle-armed young boy such as myself, so when the movie rolled around that summer, I was an easy mark. My bedroom was decked out like a dedicated Hulk gift shop, with toys, posters, t-shirts and comics littering every inch of floor space. I liked the movie just fine at the time. It had the Hulk in live action, smashing and ripping tanks apart. What more could I ask for? To be honest, comic book movies had a particularly low bar to hurdle for me back then. Just seeing the characters I loved on the big screen in any capacity felt like a dream come true. But now, in 2020, I feel confident in saying that Ang Lee's Hulk is a masterpiece of superhero cinema. In a pre-The Dark Knight world, Hulk was a complex psychodrama at a time when audiences didn't know to expect that from movies about men in tights. This was a serious and thought-provoking take on the superhero genre, without any of the self-assured wit and smirking cynicism that would go on to define the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Off the back of critically acclaimed films like 1995's Sense and Sensibility and 2000's Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, Ang Lee was given full directorial control to craft a big-budget action flick with the sensibilities of an art house picture. As Lee himself described it, Hulk was the world's most expensive indie movie. In addition to this, the director also brought an Eastern perspective to this Western mythology, incorporating the concept of the Chinese yin and yang, the dark and the light. At the heart of the Hulk story is this dichotomy between weakness and strength, repression and release. We have seen so many different on-screen depictions of the Jade Giant by now, from Hulk Smash to Hulk Smashed Avocado. But in my humble opinion, Eric Bana's portrayal of Bruce Banner and his big green alter ego remains the most faithful to the original premise set out in the comics. The Hulk was, of course, created by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, and first appeared in The Incredible Hulk Issue 1, published May 1962. Following his accidental exposure to gamma radiation, feeble scientist Dr. Bruce Banner is physically transformed from man into monster. Originally, this transformation took place whenever night fell, but as the character was further refined issues later, Banner would turn into the big green meanie when subjected to emotional stress. Don't make him angry, you wouldn't like him when he's angry. Here's Stan Lee talking about the inspiration behind the character.
I always liked Jekyll and Hyde, and I always liked the Frankenstein movie, the old one with Karloff. And in the Frankenstein movie, I always felt the monster is really the good guy. He didn't want to hurt anybody. All those idiots with torches were always chasing him up and down the hills. So I thought it would be fun to get a monster who was really a good guy. But nobody knew that. And to take a leaf from the Jekyll and Hyde thing, where he could change from a normal person into the monster. And I did the Hulk.
The influence of these figures of Gothic literature may seem superficial at first, just cartoonish monsters inspiring another cartoonish monster. But to really get to grips with the character of Bruce Banner and the Hulk, you must first understand the well from which Lee and Kirby were drawing. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, first published in 1818, is a deeply philosophical tale of science, creation, and the relationship between God and man, father and son. While with 1886's Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Robert Louis Stevenson delivered a genre-defining meditation on the duality of man, with its allegories of addiction and homosexuality. Perhaps one reason Hulk failed to connect with superhero movie lovers at the time is that, in this film at least, Hulk isn't a superhero. Like Frankenstein's monster, Hulk is a victim, a casualty of science, now public enemy number one. Upon its release, Hulk was met with folded arms by critics who decried its somber tone and morose meditation on the human condition. For Entertainment Weekly, Lisa Schwartzbaum wrote, A big-budget comic book adaptation has rarely felt so humorless and intellectually defensive about its own pulpy roots. Now, I can imagine that going into a summer blockbuster, whose namesake is famous for being a viridescent vendor of violence, you might well be dismayed to find scene after scene of glassy-eyed stares and hushed contemplation. But beneath the film's subdued surface, there rages a classic monster movie that is bold and expressive, one that doesn't concede to explosive set pieces or sheepish winks towards the fans. It's a film about anxiety and trauma, domestic abuse, and the futility of rage. Now look, I know that some of you out there will be bristling at the mere mention of toxic masculinity. The truth is that there's a lot of misconceptions around the term. You see, toxic masculinity doesn't mean that masculinity is inherently toxic, but it instead refers to the negative societal and cultural norms that are associated with being a man. The concept isn't intended to demonize men, far from it. Both women and men are the victims of toxic masculinity. By positioning us as emotionless, sex-obsessed fighting machines, it shapes men's involvement in sexist and patriarchal behaviours, and contributes to the violent and sexual abuse of women. Meanwhile, narrow-minded and stereotypical views of masculinity have a detrimental effect on our physical and emotional well-being, as well as our relationships with women, our kids, and other men. And although you might not think it to look at me, believe me, I've read the comments, but I value my masculinity. I really do, the positive aspects at least. Compassion and emotional strength, being self-sufficient, hardworking and passionate about what I do, being able to support my friends and loved ones. The social pressures placed on men to be violent, competitive, independent and unfeeling, they don't benefit anybody. They only serve to keep us caged up and emotionally repressed. A Hulk in the body of a feeble Bruce Banner. You know, suicide is the #1 cause of death amongst men under 45, and 76% of all suicides are by men. That's just over 3 out of every 4. Men are nearly 3 times more likely than women to become dependent on alcohol, and more likely to become reliant on drugs. And men are significantly less likely to access help and support for their mental health. Gender roles stigmatise and limit the emotions that boys and men are able to comfortably express. We've all heard the phrase "big boys don't cry," and trust me, they don't come much bigger than this guy. Hulk is an overtly masculine film. The Green Goliath goes up against the military, an institution long associated with unspoken codes of behaviour and toxic masculine traits that negatively impact servicemen and veterans. Banner is routinely emasculated by the film's uniformed antagonists, General Thaddeus Ross, played here by Sam Elliott, and Glenn Talbot, who is the archetypal alpha male. Actor Josh Lucas is convincingly detestable as the cocksure army major, who is the antithesis of the meek and mild Bruce Banner. This tension is made all the more palpable whenever the two share a scene with the film's love interest and daughter of General Ross, Betty, as portrayed by Jennifer Connelly. The slimy, swaggering Talbot is a sexual competitor for Betty's affection, and he's clearly gained favour with her father. What ensues is scene after scene of the two men butting heads and measuring dicks. In fact, the overwhelmingly male cast of characters is only punctuated by Bruce's mother in flashbacks and Betty Ross herself. Betty comes to represent the emotional salvation in the film, a lighthouse in the storm. Bruce, and by extension the Hulk, only allows himself to be emotionally vulnerable around Betty. We see this when the two have their King Kong moment, with the Jade Giant gently picking her up and placing her on the car. The immediate aftermath is a scene that is much derided by the film's critics, the fight between Hulk and 3 gamma-irradiated mutts. I feel that the once state-of-the-art but now vaguely comical CGI belies a scene that serves as a powerful counterpoint to the tender moment that precedes it. As soon as the dogs interrupt the pair, the Hulk's emotional guard goes back up and we see him at his most primal, animalistic and vicious. He's protecting the woman he loves, he's being heroic, but in doing so he is giving himself over to his anger and indulging in the violence. It's in moments like these that Bruce loses control and Betty loses Bruce. Those positive masculine traits that I just talked about, maintaining solidarity with a friend, succeeding at work, providing for one's family, the Hulk can't do any of those things, which means that Bruce can't either. Because of the Hulk, Banner can't have a stable life or stable relationships. And it's in this way that the Hulk becomes the perfect distillation of toxic behaviour. By the time that Hulk was released in theatres, it had been in production for over 10 years. In America during the 1990s, corporate culture had disenfranchised and de-individualized middle-class men. Menial desk jobs in colourless cubicles stripped men of their masculine power, while the growing rate of fatherless families led to a whole generation of boys facing a crisis of masculine identity. Office jobs in shirts and ties alienated men from the very thing that society had always told them was valuable: strength, practicality, and being the paradigmatic hunter-gatherer. Rather than deriving a sense of value from working with one's hands, men were churned up into the wheels of consumerism, and suddenly had to take an interest in what gym to go to, or hair product to use, or whose name should be on the waistband of their underpants. Just as General Thunderbolt Ross seeks to commodify Banner's abnormal affliction to create an army of super soldiers, the strength and athleticism of the male body was increasingly sexualized and superficialized in mainstream media. When The Incredible Hulk was first birthed onto the pages of 1960s comics, concepts of masculinity were undergoing a transformation of their own. Bruce Banner's origin story is set to a backdrop of sexual liberation, the civil rights movement, and the looming threat of all-out nuclear war. Meanwhile, the growing debate around the US's involvement in the Vietnam War was calling into question the idea of the soldier as the pinnacle of virtuous masculinity. In a similar way, when Robert Louis Stevenson first published his Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, the emerging middle-class men of Victorian England were facing their own crisis of masculinity. Much like corporate America in the 1990s, industrialisation had brought on great socio-economic change, and left in its wake a sense of class consciousness. Men were expected to be well-mannered and genteel, and in addition to this perceived domestication of masculinity, the Victorian era also saw the affirmation of gender roles that prevail to this day. Both Jekyll and Hyde and Hulk depict mild-mannered scientists who struggle against societal gender roles. While Dr. Jekyll is motivated by the allure of transgression, and Dr. Banner by his pursuit of knowledge, both men ultimately find damnation through alter egos that uncage their primitive violent masculinity. For comic book readers, the Hulk's violent rebellion against emotional repression may be the ultimate power fantasy, and a moment of cathartic release. But the moral of both stories is that unfettered masculine power comes at a price, hurting those around you and isolating yourself. This is the paradigm that Ang Lee set out to accurately portray, and it's where the film's greatest strengths lie. In addition to the militaristic masculinity of Thunderbolt Ross, the corporate masculinity of Major Talbot, and Bruce's own tortured masculinity, the real villain of the piece is something much more menacing: daddy issues. As Ang Lee puts it in his director's commentary for the film, every boy's worst nightmare, your dad is a puny human. David Banner, named after the protagonist of the 1977 Incredible Hulk TV series, and played here by gravelly advert for why you should use conditioner, Nick Nolte, was also a genetic scientist like his son. During the film's opening credits, we see a young David experimenting on animals, extracting DNA, and mixing ominous green liquids. After learning that the government has put the kibosh on his super soldier project, the enraged scientist, already consumed by his work, takes matters into his own hands, and becomes the first human test subject. But when little Bruce Banner is born shortly thereafter, it becomes clear that anger runs in the family. You see, Bruce getting a face full of gamma radiation serves as the catalyst for his transformation into the Hulk, but it's not the root cause of his terrible temperament. He inherited his altered genetics from his father. The Hulk isn't just some freak science project gone wrong, not really. This is the story of a toxic childhood and the legacy of an abusive father. Throughout the film, there is a recurring motif of a closed door. It's something that haunts Bruce in flashbacks, and also when he and Betty later revisit his childhood home. The closed door explicitly represents the bedroom door behind which David Banner abused and ultimately murdered Bruce's mother, but it also symbolises emotional repression and the fear of the monster that lurks behind the door, locked away and waiting to be set free. In fact, these flashbacks and ghostly voices from the past occur throughout the film, underpinning the long-lasting effects of a traumatic childhood. There's actually some precedent for this in the comics. Bill Mantlo first introduced the idea of Bruce being the victim of an abusive father back in the 1980s, while legendary Hulk scribe Peter David expanded further by suggesting that Banner's multiple personalities were the direct result of his childhood abuse. In The Incredible Hulk issue 377, Bruce dives deep into his subconscious and finds that his memories are being terrorised by a mysterious monster. We soon learn that the monster represents an abusive father, who, just like in the film, kills Bruce's mother, causing him to suppress his emotions. Cry, show some emotion.
Emotion's bad. It hurts people.
Not all emotion. Cry, blasted. Cry big, racking sobs.
There. I reacted. A nuclear reaction. Happy now?
Much like Frankenstein's monster, Bruce Banner is burdened by the ambition of his creator. He didn't ask to be made this way, and he rejects his father's legacy even though he's doomed to fulfill it. In fact, parent-child tensions are a recurring theme in Mary Shelley's pioneering work of Gothic horror. Victor Frankenstein both literally circumvents femininity by finding a way to create life without the need of a mother, and figuratively rejects femininity by being unloving and unnurturing towards his nascent offspring. As is the case with Hulk, it's the trauma of this discompassionate upbringing that truly creates the monster. While both father and son in Hulk are scientists, consumed by their work in the same field, there is one crucial distinction between their motivations. While David Banner seeks to militarise his genetics work by creating super soldiers, Bruce harnesses nanomed technology to cure sicknesses such as cancer and Alzheimer's. Again, we see the juxtaposition of the traditionally masculine ideals of war and competition versus the non-masculine compassion and altruism. Hulk's third act climax met some derision from critics at the time of its release. The fully computer-generated fight between Bruce Banner and his formless father, which culminates in the latter swelling into a mushroom cloud of negative emotions, was considered too abstract by most audiences, with one reviewer referring to it as, quote, a big noise. But once again, I feel like this is one aspect of the movie that is often misunderstood. In this scene, Bruce and the Hulk are unified, as we hear the not-so-jolly green giant string a sentence together for the first time.
Думаешь удержать ее? Тогда забирай. Столько!
Is he man or monster? Or is he both? This now humanized Hulk realizes that the only way to overcome his abusive father is to unlock that door and let those negative emotions out. Meanwhile, it's David Banner who becomes the embodiment of Bruce's anger and trauma. The power struggle between father and son reflects the two halves of Bruce's fractured psyche, the yin and the yang. But now Hulk is the inner child, and David is the enormous green rage monster. As Robert Louis Stevenson writes in the closing chapter of Jekyll and Hyde, it was the curse of mankind that these incongruous figures were thus bound together, that in the agonized womb of consciousness, these polar twins should be continuously struggling. When I was a kid, I always related most to Peter Parker. I think a lot of comic book fans do. We like to imagine ourselves as the shy and nerdy but ultimately righteous hero who will always prevail against evil. But the older I get, the more I find that I'm no Peter Parker. I'm Bruce Banner. I think we all have a Hulk that rages inside of us, and it's not just the things that make us angry, it's our worst fears and our greatest insecurities. It's any time we've ever felt powerless, rejected, or inadequate. It's the things that make us anxious or self-conscious, make it difficult to connect with others, or just make us really fucking sad. You know, you can't be like General Ross and his army and fight that Hulk. You won't win. You'll just end up hurting yourself and those around you. But you can be more like Betty. You can be kind and you can be compassionate, and you can listen to what your Hulk has got to say. On screen right now are some mental health organisations and resources that, I don't know, maybe you'll find helpful. I'll also put links to all of these in the description of this video. If you are feeling lost or hopeless or frustrated, I just want to say that you're not alone. There is help out there, and there are people who understand whatever it is that you're going through. It's not weak to ask for help if you need it. It doesn't make you a puny Banner. In fact, it makes you strong, like the Hulk. It's okay to be sad and angry. You know, God knows there's a lot of things to be sad and angry about in the world right now. And after all, it's not that easy being green. Wait, hold on. Here's the thing. The video was supposed to end with me singing Being Green. You know, the Kermit the Frog song about wishing you were something else, but ultimately realising your own dignity and self-worth. If you haven't heard the song before, please go look it up because it's beautiful, and I chose it because I thought it would be funny and goofy, but at the same time poignant and moving. But then YouTube slapped me with a big old copyright claim, so I guess that's not happening anymore. Instead, I'll just say this. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for watching. Stay safe and take care of yourselves, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye bye.